Welcome to the Emerge Collaborative podcast. I'm Falon.
And I'm Rachel.
Together, we share more than 2 decades of experience working with young adults on college campuses.
So on this podcast, we're engaging the questions we hear in our ministry to better equip those who care for the emerging adults in their lives.
We are here with Dr. Christina Littlefield. Christina is a professor of both journalism and religion. She has worked as a reporter, directed student media, and is familiar with pretty much every dimension of church history. Her research focuses on the intersection of the Christian faith and social life in American history, and her most recent research has focused on the development of Christian nationalism, a particularly pertinent topic for our time. Welcome, Christina. We're so excited to hear from you today.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you both, Falon and Rachel.
When I was your student, one of the things that really stood out to me was your reminder of this line from our university's mission statement. Truth, having nothing to fear from investigation, shall be pursued relentlessly in all disciplines. Mm-hmm. And that's a really valuable statement, both in the Christian faith and in journalism and in exploring and learning about the world around us. And yet, so many contemporary Christian voices communicate directly and indirectly a lot of skepticism about university life, about what students learn, especially in higher education settings, though that's bleeding into public schools of all settings. Why are so many people, especially in some Christian communities, anxious about what students will encounter, particularly in college?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And I think it is because of messaging that they've been receiving for decades. I think it is because of messaging that has increased in the kind of polarized news content that they're ingesting and reading, and specific voices that I'm studying who are actively telling them to keep their kids out of college. And so we live in a very polarized society as much as ever, if not more than ever. And so colleges now are a part of those broader culture wars. And historically, from the beginning of Christianity, we've had this tension, right? Reason or revelation? And how do we tease them out? How do we hold them together? Which one comes highest? And so different Christian traditions put reason highest and different Christian traditions put revelation highest. And so this dates back to Tertullian, right? One of the early church fathers, 2nd century, famous questions, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Or the Apostle Paul, right? Who went to the agora, the open space in Acts 17 and did a sermon to the unknown God to use what the Greek culture knew as a way of preaching the gospel to them. Or Justin Martyr, right, who was one of the earliest apologists. All of these guys predate Tertullian, who was looking at Greek philosophy as a way of helping people understand and arguing Christians should be the best citizens according to the culture that they lived in. The Gospel of John, right, is using the Greek idea of the logos and in the opening beautiful passages about Jesus as the Word, right? And I think the peak is Thomas Aquinas in medieval Christendom, right? He really synthesized this really well, maintained loyalty to Christ as highest, so revelation does come first, but reason was given to us by God. And so we can honor that, we can think through that. And so all these tensions, right, are there. And a lot of it comes down to our view of human nature. I'm probably boring you guys at this point, but
this is great.
Every philosopher starts with this question: are we basically good or are we basically evil? Which is it? And scripture, I think, points to our innate goodness, right? In Genesis, when it says we're made in the image of God, or when Christ chases the individual lost sheep, or when he ultimately dies on the cross for our redemption. He decides we're worthy of being redeemed, but of course it also points to the need for redeemed. So we also see our innate rubbishness and the fall and the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden, or Cain's murder of his brother, or in Romans 3:23, when, Paul writes, we all fall short of the glory of God, and ultimately, we need Christ's redemption. And so those who lean into a university education as good likely also believe that humans are good and God's creation is good and human knowledge has goodness in it. And those who fear human knowledge are leaning heavier into our innate sinfulness, right? And so they are then fearful of human knowledge leading us astray from God, leading us astray from revelation. And so my own university education and the emphasis in the liberal arts and the Christian faith held those together, right? That we have to always remember we're innately made in God's image. We all have dignity and worth. Ooh, and we also all fall short. We're all frail and human and have all kinds of fleshly needs that lead us astray. So like, how do we hold those in tension and use discernment to think what is good in what we're learning and what human knowledge can do, while also still holding that loyalty and revelation as highest.
That's so interesting to hear how theology and history have informed where we are right now, going so far back and connected to people and individuals we may not know the names of and may not know anything about their lives, but that they have influenced and spoken to in various ways where we are as a society right now. And I find that really profound.
Yeah, listening to you walk us through the different ways that we see in scripture, in Christian history, this wrestling, this kind of teasing out, like, how do we understand our human nature and how that relates to, can we trust our reason? Can we trust ourselves in that space? Makes a lot of sense. And I'm wondering, like, as we look at American culture and where we are right now, particularly what you said at the start, which is like, there are people who are pretty popular, who are flat out telling the masses, don't go to college, don't send your kids to college, right?
It's a scam.
Yeah, it's a scam, right? Exactly. Again, kind of going back to what you said, like, don't trust your own reason. That's a waste of 4 years in essence. How do you think we've gotten here in light of everything that you just talked about, like the early history of the church and this wrestling, like this anti-intellectualism that we're seeing?
Yeah.
How do we get here?
So really, anti-intellectualism today really goes back to the modernist fundamentalist debates at the turn of the 20th century. So roughly 1870 to even 1930, peaking with the Scopes monkey trial in 1925. And so progressive Christians in the 19th century, they perceived, and we're talking in the American culture, they perceived post the Civil War that their Protestant hegemony, their power, their influence over the country was waning. And they were trying to show how Christianity could actually answer all of the social ills that they were seeing. So the U.S. was rapidly urbanizing, right? Creating these massive big cities, often with not proper planning. They were industrializing, right? Moving from agriculture to factories, manufacturing. And we were assimilating massive numbers of immigrants, and the kind of immigrants were changing and shifting, making them a little harder to assimilate and welcome. And so on top of all those kind of social problems, they were also adapting to biblical criticism coming out of Germany, raising questions about biblical authorship, raising questions about, is religion revealed or a cultural phenomenon? They were looking at new research, starting actually with like geology and how old is the earth, which kind of messed with some people's ideas about, is Genesis to be taken literal? And of course, then evolution, right? Raised questions about how humans were created. And so in the 19th century, we also, from the founding of the U.S., really, modernity was bringing all of these new rights, individual rights like freedom of the press, freedom of speech, even freedom of religion, that were all a challenge to the church. And so every form of religion in the world has had to adapt to modernity, and how are they going to evolve? And so we had progressive Christians trying to show where Christianity was still incredibly useful, but they were accepting some of this human knowledge and adjusting and saying, yes, this, but not that. And then the fundamentalists were essentially a group of conservative Christians who reacted hard, militantly, George Marsden says, against modernity. And their name actually comes from a series of pamphlets produced between 1910 and 1915 called The Fundamentals. So these were people who were trying to sincerely hold on to the fundamental core of their faith, right? Particularly the authority of Scripture. And so one thing that they invented, and they did invent it in the 1840s, actually, so far earlier, was the idea that Scripture wasn't just God-breathed, as 1 Timothy tells us, but infallible, inerrant in the original manuscripts, right? So there's always a caveat, but also that every word was inspired and it was all perspicuity. It's a hard word to say. The clarity, like Scripture was common sense. So even this movement was bringing in kind of like Scottish Enlightenment ideas of like very pragmatism kind of ideas of how we can even read Scripture. And so they pushed hard back against evolution, and particularly the byproducts of evolution, which incidentally the progressive Christians pushed back against too. So like social Darwinism, which was a survival of the fittest mentality that was just antithetical to Christian thought, and eugenics, right? Responsible for all kinds of evils. So Christians were like, I think, rightfully pushing back against that. And so this, though, planted the seed that all secular thought was corrosive to the faith, corrosive to morals. And so in this earlier 19th century, fundamentalists still valued knowledge and created their own schools. It was at the turn of the century that many fundamentalists adopted premillennial dispensationalism, which again, 19th century invention by this guy, John Nelson Darby, which is saying we're broken up into these different dispensations. We're living in the last one. You know this well. Would have been.
I've spent a little time with the fundamentalists. Yes.
Yes. You know, we're in the final dispensation before Judgment Day. And he taught ideas like the rapture, that we're going to just be, you know, whisked off.
And leave our clothes behind. In piles.
Yes.
According to the Left Behind series.
Yes. Yeah, the book has popularized it. And that God has a special role for Israel. What this teaching did, premillennium existed, but this was like a new Rome. It taught them that the world didn't matter at all. They had no need to reform or correct it or help it. And in fact, Dwight Moody, a famous evangelist at this time, famously said, like, God gave him this vision of a lifeboat and said, save as many people as you can. So there wasn't the need to do the social reform, but there was a need to save as many people. And so this also gave them the idea that they had kind of almost like a gnosis, right? A secret knowledge that they had that even other Christians didn't have. That meant they were, again, even more so pushing back against any kind of secular knowledge. And so the American press absolutely ridiculed fundamentalists at the Scopes monkey trial, like quite unfairly portrayed them, actually. And so many fundamentalists then created their own subculture, their own media, their own versions of the Bible, their own books, their own music, eventually their own like Left Behind series and like very, very bad movies and TV.
Their own university institutions.
Their own universities. Yes, that was already happening. And so much later, during the rise of the Christian right as a political force in the United States, so this is like they're kind of coming out of their subcultures and now they're engaging in the world again. Really, there was a Swiss theologian, Francis Schaeffer, and he wrote a book called How Should We Then Live? And Pastor Tim LaHaye wrote The Secular Mind. And these were essentially arguing that the U.S. had left the Christian faith behind. We were founded as a Christian nation, which is false, by the way, and that we needed to restore. But part of what we needed to battle was secular humanism, right? Which is what was being taught in our public schools and our public universities and was corrupting essentially the American mind, telling us that we didn't need God anymore and we didn't need revelation at all. We could only have reason. And so this taught fundamentalist evangelicals that all secular thought was potentially corrosive, that there was nothing good or redeeming in it anymore. And that's where like Mark Knoll, who is an evangelical historian himself, wrote The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And it was that there was no evangelical mind. They had been some of the best scholars in the 19th century. And by the mid to late 20th century, they weren't producing any scholarship that was of value in the wider world. And I think there is some things that have started to change that, including some work here at the university where I work at by Richard Hughes and the Lilly grant that we got for the Center on Faith and Learning to show that Christian faith and the life of the mind can actually go together and strengthen each other. And so there's been a counter push since the early 2000s in this, but that kind of gives you some of the background and some of the history here.
That's super helpful. There's a lot of names, a lot of allusions to ideas, philosophies, theologies, events, movements that I think we could spend so much time digging into.
Yes,
and it's
whole classes.
But it's really interesting to hear them kind of strung together quickly and to get a broader scope of the narrative. And of course, people can Google any of those things and dig into them as much as they would like. And there is so much interesting stuff there to better understand our society, our culture, our faith, and how all of those things work together. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to where we are right now, to the parents who are sending their children off to school, to the young adults who are getting ready to go to college or who perhaps are already in college. How can they understand their context, how American evangelicalism and the far extreme far-right Christian nationalism have shaped the way we think about universities, the world, even truth itself, and how that's changed the academic endeavor?
Yeah. Oh gosh. Yeah. Like where to start? So I've been studying the Christian right. It's a big part of my research right now, and fundamentalist evangelicals and even some Catholics, where we really are seeing the demonization of higher education and portraying universities and even kindergarten through, grade 12 as kind of bastions of indoctrination of so-called woke ideologies, right? Anything that is left of them, by the way, gets called woke. So woke is very, very broad and not at all in the original use of the term. And others on the right are actually arguing that universities are a waste of time, that they are programming students toward unbiblical, ungodly ideas, including Marxism, nihilism, anarchism, socialism, gender ideologies. And behind a lot of these is actually kind of their own ideology, right? It's their own nationalistic populism and this rejection of the ruling elite, which includes professors and medical experts and scientists and journalists and government bureaucrats, media, celebrity, right? All in favor of the more common people. So what we're seeing from the right, though, is that all knowledge is under attack, right? So the current administration is slashing funding for medical science, natural science, social science, education, going after universities that don't align with their own ideology, if you can figure out even what that is, right? Because it's a weird hybrid.
And it changes a lot, it seems to.
It changes, it's incoherent, it has people from very different worldviews being lumped together, right? So, but this attack is really coming from that far right's distrust of education and a ruling elite and a populist desire to uplift the common person, which I actually wish they would lean into some economic policies there that would help the common person.
Yeah.
But it's we as a nation are rejecting expertise across the board. Right. And while I think I'm the question everything sort as a journalism person, but I think we're doing so to a level of our own detriment. Right. Because if you're not willing to accept established research, it then leaves you open to all kinds of conspiracy theories that are actually a lot more harmful.
Why are we so eager to give up on intellectual pursuit?
Thinking about this, my dad, he was a hippie libertarian. He freaked out when he learned I was going to read the Communist Manifesto. And I'm like, Dad, I'm not agreeing with it. And we're not being taught to agree with it. We're taught to understand it and then critique it.
And be aware of it.
And be aware
as
of it.
a really important global influence.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's been a phenomenon in classes I've noticed, where recently I assigned students a text that I personally agree with, but I'm not asking them to agree with. That's supplementary to our understanding of scripture. And it's a scholar that it's good to be familiar with. And class discussions, I noticed even just in the last 5 years, have changed from, oh, I disagree with this piece, or I really liked this, but I'm wondering about this, to why does my professor want me to think all these things? Like, that's the immediate
Why would
response.
it even be assigned?
Exactly. Yeah. As opposed to we're engaging in dialogue over the text, not I'm asking you to agree. I'm not asking you to sign on the dotted line. But that's, I think, the way that students are now being primed to receive education.
I think it's just their world of YouTube and then TikTok videos is a passive. Right? I'm going to passively receive this without really thinking about it.
Yeah.
Rather than, I'm going to think about this and push back here and accept that and fight with this point, right?
Yeah.
And so I actually say constantly, you never have to agree with anything we're reading. I want you to point out the weaknesses. I want you to think critically. I want you to adopt only what you actually find useful and beneficial and true.
Yeah.
That's a really good observation in the differences of kinds of media. Like, it's all media. A book is media and is a medium of communication, and so is a TikTok reel. But there is something to be said about something you hold in your hands and you have to engage, like a person sitting across from you at the table. Like, you look in their eyes and you engage them and you follow the train of thought, or you don't, and you wrestle with it and you're able to dialogue. Whereas like when we're kind of constantly receiving these really tiny snippets, they come in, we don't process them, we don't think about them. We might think fleetingly, oh, I agree, I like that, or I disagree, I don't like that, but then like don't actually engage it. And it shapes who we are. Like, it seeps in ways that are really powerful and have long-term impacts, but we're not being reflective about it. And I think that's a really good observation of like types of media and types of conversation. Two-way conversation with someone sitting across from you from a table is very different than hearing someone speak at you from a stage alongside others, where you're just like are just receiving and consuming, as opposed to engaging and dialoguing and thinking critically and inviting further dialogue and asking questions. And those are just very different experiences.
Yeah. And I think it's happening with not just teens, not just emerging adults. We're all inundated by it now. I'm thinking about the experience of a parent who is about to send their kid to college and is already anxious. Like, and I say that compassionately. Like, that is that's a terrifying moment. That is a reasonable moment to be like, wow, I'm feeling trepidation. I'm launching my student into the world. And on top of that is receiving messages like this that's giving even more anxiety, adding more fuel to the fire. And now there's this other thing to worry about. So it's not just, is my kid going to be safe? It's not just, is my kid going to, stand on his or her own 2 feet and be able to make good decisions and all of these things. It's also like, is my kid going to lose their faith? Is my kid going to be indoctrinated? Should I be sending my kid to college? Should I be sending them somewhere else instead? What should we do? And I feel like it becomes kind of this existential anxiety as opposed to just like, I hope that they make good choices. That is a whole other level now. Can we talk about that a little bit? Like, what would you say as someone who's studied all of this and is really engaged with, you've submitted to hours and hours of listening to this kind of content. So like,
try and understand it.
What would you say to a parent who's now adding these big questions and anxieties onto the already anxious time?
Yeah, and I'm of the age where my friends are sending their kids to college for the first time.
Yeah.
Or even sending kid to, and I'm now empty nesting, which is a weird thing. My friends who had kids young. And so, I think there are real healthy concerns. And for me, they're all social, right? Peer pressure. That's what I would be worried about. Are they going to be pressured to have sex or like engage in hookup culture? Are they going to be pressured to drink? I remember being pressured to drink, right, as an undergrad, even at a Christian university that was dry, right? Loneliness. anxiety, depression. Like, I think those are healthy concerns. I think any kind of fear of indoctrination or woke ideologies or any other form of learning is fear-based. I would really encourage parents to never be afraid what their kid is learning in classes, but just encourage them to think critically about it, encourage them to ask questions, encourage them to push back as needed, have them evaluate it with Christ as highest. Like, you can encourage that and seek always to have a growth mindset, right? That they're always learning and seeking to grow as a disciple of Christ, but also as a human being, as a scholar. But yeah, I think I wouldn't ever worry about that. But I would worry of like, okay, is my kid making good friends? Like, I would want to go meet the people they're meeting, right? I think one of the best things parents can encourage their kid going off to college to do from a Christian home is to find a church, find a local intergenerational church where they're going to be surrounded by families who will invite them to lunch and care for them and mentor them, that the older adults that they can look up to for support and guidance, right? Not just only fellow 20-somethings who are like-minded, but, some multiple generations. And then I would really encourage them to join academic or what we call co-curricular clubs that go along with their major. So like, I do student media. I know some of my other colleagues run research labs that students can get involved in. There's the choir and the music programs and the theater programs, right? It's not just an easy way to make friends, which it is. Some of my lifelong college friends were in those activities, but they're going to learn, they're going to build character, they're going to develop skills for their future lives, and it will help them avoid when they're busy. They will avoid some of that like cruise ship like behavior of college, right? But maybe, they're going to they might still do some of that, but they're going to stay focused on what matters to them because they're going to have these connections and clubs. And I think that's one thing that a small liberal Christian college can offer that bigger schools can't, those kind of high touch experiences. And I know from my own university, our international programs is another element there that is just really a phenomenal way to learn and grow and develop as a human and as a Christian.
That's so good.
What I hear you saying is like, really, when we talk about the college experience, there are so many elements to it that do form you and shape you and can positively contribute to your faith growth, that when we think about this fear of any sort of like indoctrination or, what's my kid going to learn, that really it's not relevant to the actual experience of the student, that there are other things to be intentional about with your teen as you're launching, that this one, A, isn't actually happening on college campuses, but B, even if it were, is like so low on the list because it's not going to be what.
Yeah, a lot of us like to joke. Like, we can barely get students to do their reading anymore.
I know, it's
like
so
the
funny.
idea that we're indoctrinating them.
Also,
like,
to our listeners who have not been in a faculty meeting before, university professors cannot coordinate with one another to save their lives. So there is no coordinated attack because they can't even like coordinate to, write something together. Like, it's impossible.
No,
So,
there's no group think. There's like too many niche fields.
Yes.
And if you don't do it exactly the way that scholar does it,
Faculty and administrators are not of one mind at any institutions. So you can set aside your fears of propaganda being indoctrinated into your kid.
I think part of this is like, you just have to trust that you raised your kid well.
Yeah.
And I think having an open, you've taught me this. Falon did a panel for how do we reach the students who are the nuns, the religious unaffiliated, and this like idea of this open, curious posture to meeting them where they're at. And so I think parents can, if they just keep that open, curious posture, like know that your kid is supposed to grow, right? College is a time that their brains are solidifying, right? They don't really, like 25 is when your brain is like fully solidified. So like that 18 to 22 period, you are absolutely, your brain is still growing and solidifying and you're still figuring out who you are. It's supposed to be a time of change and exploration. It is natural to push back a little bit on what you grew up with and start having some questions about, okay, my parents believe this. Do I still believe that? That's part of the growth. I pushed back a lot against my dad, but I also like see how foundational he is to my thought even now, right? So give them that space to figure it out and have an open, curious posture so you can stay a part of the journey as they go. And I would also say, like, if something is raising a flag for you, like you don't like that they're being assigned to read someone who's seminal in world history, if you can, if you're able, your own time constraints, your own resources or abilities, consider reading it yourself.
Yeah.
That's so good.
And then have a conversation with your young person about that. Debate it, fight with it, like say, and, you know, try to see like, okay, not just straw man, tear it apart, but I always like the steel man, right? Get its strongest argument, but say, okay, here's why I still think that this way is better, right?
Yeah.
That's where you can actually really engage them.
And that's such a great act of love to just show interest in what someone else is experiencing. Like that's what a sweet act of love to do that for anyone in our lives, our partners, our friends, our children.
As you said that, I'm like, oh my gosh, how fun would that have been if one of my parents was like, oh yeah, you mentioned this book, so I read it.
Yeah, like how sweet.
I love that. Yeah. That's such a great piece of advice.
A funny story, like I remember this conversation with my grandmother where I was so in love with Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning that I'm like, have you heard of this guy? Do you know anything about this book? And she's like, he was my professor. And then she told me stories about him and how that book was very meaningful to like the kind of narrative therapy that she did for years, right?
Wow.
And so like those moments are precious, right? And I would have loved for my dad to have actually read the Communist Manifesto and helped me fight it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Because he did raise me to be a little capitalist.
Yeah,
That's great. It's all really good advice for parents. What would you say to a student who's curious, who's eager to learn, but feels maybe a little guilty or maybe a little afraid themselves that they're being quote unquote too secular, or may even feel maybe that they're rebelling a bit either against their parents or against their families or against their church or perhaps even against God by asking questions and being willing to engage some of these ideas that are different than what they have been familiar with?
Yeah, I resonate with that in part because like even in accepting faith, I was going against my agnostic father. So and there was some battles there that were hard, but I would just stress that like God can handle their questions. Right? He may not give us the answers we want, but I go back to that mission statement, right? That's on all my syllabi. All truth is God's truth, and truth has nothing to fear from investigation, but should be pursued relentlessly in all disciplines. So I think if we're seeking God with all our heart, mind, and soul, and seeking to love others, we're going to find God, and we can trust that God is going to use all this knowledge and all this skills and all the character formation that is happening in college, and he's going to use all of that to develop one's gifts. And I say that to my students all the time. Like, I believe our talents are a gift from God that we are to steward and use for the good of God's creation. Yeah. And so I think if you like lean in, like, I love God, I love others, I'm going to use this knowledge for that purpose, you really can't go wrong, right? God will always work through you, always working toward the good.
Yeah. That is beautiful. What would it look like for, I think, both students and their parents to see college not as a threat to their faith, but as a place where faith can deepen and grow? How would you encourage parents and students to, and I would say in light of our conversation, it might involve a shift in how they're thinking about it right now. Like, how would you encourage them to make that shift if there needs to be one?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely encourage them to reject the idea that college is a place of indoctrination, but rather see college as a place of challenge and growth. I got to say, it's funny to me that people think college is a threat to faith because I came to faith as a first-year student in my university. I was a cultural Christian with this agnostic father who was hostile to organized religion. And when I came to my small Christian liberal arts college, I met Christians who really lived their faith and really engaged my questions and welcomed all my questions and welcomed my doubts. And so I was baptized in the faculty jacuzzi in November of that first year. I do joke I was like Hermione at Hogwarts, where then I wanted to learn all about this new world, and I became a religion minor, and I got a master's in religion communication, and then eventually a PhD in church history, and I now teach religion. But I think I would look at a school and see, okay, is my child going to get a high touch experience? Are they going to be a single dot in a flood of 35,000 students, right? Which is the reality of a big state university. And if that's the case, and that's the best program, right? Your kid wants to be an engineer. Okay, what other smaller touch things might be available, even if it's not by that university, right? One of my best friends does campus ministry at Arizona State University. She's one of like dozens. So like, where can I get my kid plugged in if they're going to be in a place like that? Or if you can send them to a small liberal arts college, obviously I have a bias toward that, right? Then you can say, okay, what is the faculty to student ratio? What kind of activities can they get involved in? How can I get them plugged in? So this is going to be a place of growth. And so, yeah, I would just reiterate local intergenerational church, co-curricular academic clubs. Like, I think getting plugged into both of those will ensure that your child has a strong foundation and connection, and will not be easily swayed by some of maybe the more social pressures. But I think, yeah, looking at the whole experience as not something that's going to push you away from your faith, but something that's going to let you come out refined and stronger in your faith, that you will know what you believe, and be able to defend it if necessary, but also more importantly, live it out in your character of who you are.
I also came to faith in college, and it was so beautiful to have my faith strengthened by my friends, but also by professors like you who poured into me and shaped me over the course of years, and then later became really wonderful friends. And so thank you for sharing your own story, but also for participating in the formation of other students.
Well, I mean, Falon was one of my very first students ever, as was her husband. And the truth is, like, it comes full circle. Like, where I have learned and grown from you and been ministered to by you as you've been working in ministry, and as you became a colleague and not just a student. But even as a student, I think you all kept me on my toes.
Well, thank you so much, Christina, for this conversation. I loved getting a history of how we've ended up here, where we are, and talking about the ways that we can be attuned to what's going on in our culture, but not allow that fear to seep in. And I particularly appreciated the advice and tips that you gave to parents for engaging with what their college student is learning and talking about how faith formation shows up on college campuses. So really grateful for the conversation. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.